There's so much to think about when making a teapot. There's its functionality, the aesthetic, its weight, how does it feel in the hand, how does it pour, does the lid stay in place as it's tipped to one side, and so much more. In my book, I call them the final boss of the pottery world, and in this video I hope to explain the thoughts that go through my head as I throw and assemble one, or many in this instance, as this film shows the creation of 20 of them, all of which are a bit different, but they all need to do the same job. I throw the bodies of my teapots on bats, due to them having quite a delicate rim and gallery whereupon the lid will be placed. I don't want this part of the pot to be distorted, as might happen if I were to lift the pot away with only my hands. Instead I throw it on this wooden disc, which, after the body has been thrown, I can pry away and lift off, the pot coming along with it. I'm also not going to wire any of the pots through at this stage for the same reason, as I want to avoid any distortion as best I can. So I'll wait until they're leather hard before I separate them from the bat. When making teapots, I always begin by throwing the body and the lid, and then afterwards, towards the end of the day, I'll make all the spouts, as this way they won't dry out as much as the other parts, and I like to attach my spouts when they're still quite soft, but more on that later. This first teapot I'm throwing will have a cylindrical body with a step towards the base. I pull the walls up evenly and slowly, and I make sure there isn't too much weight left in the bottoms of these, as teapots do need to be relatively light, as they obviously become much heavier as soon as they're filled with liquid, tea. So if the teapot is thick and heavy before any tea has even been added to it, then that isn't a great thing, as you don't want the vessel to weigh a ton, to the point that it can be difficult to handle and pour. I finish the lower sections of these teapots, whilst the opening at the top is still wide enough for my hand to squeeze in. The step is created by forcing my nail into the wall to make a right angle, and then the clay above it is pulled up to increase the height of the pot. With the lowest portion complete, I can begin throwing the shoulder of the teapot to make the opening more narrow, and with that diameter set, I can proceed to scrape the rest of the slip off the outside of the shape, to leave much cleaner, straight walls. For each teapot body, I'm using about 730 grams of clay. Any excess water and slip is then soaked up, as you don't want to leave a puddle in your pot overnight, as in some cases it can weaken the clay left there and disintegrate the base of your pot, so always scoop it out. I then use a chamois leather to soften the rim, scrape clean the bat of any slip, including the side, as otherwise all this clay just ends up drying on the bat, which you'll eventually have to clean. And finally, I use a pair of calipers to measure the opening. They're slotted in carefully, and I open them up bit by bit until they span the gap. I then measure this on a ruler and then invert the calipers. This way they're the same measurement, but they measure it from the outside. I then pry the bat off and set the teapot aside. That's 1 down, 19 to go. Although before I throw another body, I first need to make this teapot's lid. I'm using softer clay to throw these, which makes centering and flattening them very easy. And for these I'm using about 200 to 250 grams of clay, depending on the width of the opening. For these lids, I throw a flat disc and then open them up, leaving a thick base and a thick rim. The thick rim is then separated into two parts, one becoming the vertical locating flange, which is pushed towards the centre, and then there's the horizontal flange, which is the part that will sit on top of the gallery, and it's the right angle where these two bisect, which has to match the measurement set by my calipers. I then sponge off slip covering the surface and scrape clean the outer portions with a sharp metal kidney. Doing so helps the thrown component dry out more quickly, which in these colder, damp months really helps. Then, like before, I scrape the bat clean. To stick these MDF rounds onto this pad of leather hard clay, I wipe a touch of slip onto the back of them, tap centre it into the middle, and then firmly shake it back and forth like so. I then dampen a patch in the centre, as this will help the next piece of clay stick down onto it, although it's important not to make it too wet before you do this, as otherwise the lump of clay will slide off. The thicker expansive clay around the edge is then pinched and pulled up in consecutive movements, making them thinner and taller. This teapot will be much like the other, although the step will be slightly higher up. Once thrown and removed from the wheel, I'll leave these teapots out to slowly dry in the studio for a day or two until all the components turn leather hard, at which point they can be trimmed and assembled. This drying process isn't something I rush, and I'd rather let it happen naturally and slowly as opposed to forcing them dry with a fan or a heat gun, as when rushing, that's generally when things go wrong. And as there are so many things on a teapot that need to go right, in order for it to perform correctly, I'm far more careful making these types of pots as compared to, say, mugs or bowls. Pots I've made many more of, so I feel more confident in their creation. As for the spouts, I throw them in an entirely different way. It's a method called throwing off the hump, and this is when you take a larger piece of clay, wedge it up so it's void of any pockets of air and is one lovely smooth, even texture. This mound of clay is then taken to the wheel and centered. I then only work with the very top section of clay, throwing a small portion of it and turning it into a spout before removing it and then drawing up more clay from underneath it to throw into another. I center a piece of clay cupped between two hands, open it up, and then throw it like any other piece of clay. Although things do generally tend to be less stable, as obviously the massive clay underneath the part you're throwing can itself become off-centered, which causes the pot you're making on top to undulate. To make my spouts, I create an opening like so, with a wall that's about 2 centimeters high. I then place a finger inside and I push the wall up against it. My finger inside stays still, and I hold it securely so it creates the shape I want inside the spout. Once I've gained enough height, I switch to a wooden dowel for the inside, which I compress and collar the clay against, making the inside of the spout very smooth. If the rim is undulating too much, I simply cut it away, and I also throw my spouts in such a way that there is some thickness left in the walls, which I later carve away with a knife and smooth over with a sponge on a stick. This helps me to throw the spouts much faster, as I don't have to worry about them being very thin. It also makes picking them off easier, and some of that extra material will actually be useful later on, as it provides clay that I can easily blend into the body of the teapot. Once the curve is roughly there, I use a curved metal kidney, like so, and scrape away a good portion of the outer walls with it. My aim here is to make a seamless curve that begins at the top practically vertical before splaying out to almost horizontal at the base. Now, with these spouts, I'm not specifically making an individual spout for an individual teapot. Rather, I'm going to be throwing a whole variety of spouts of slightly different shapes and sizes. This way, I can pick and choose the best for each of the teapots. As with making so many new shapes, I'm not sure which spout will work best for each of them. So there is quite a bit of trial and error at this stage, which is also why I threw about 30 spouts overall, as whilst I make a lot of lidded pots, I don't make that many spouts, meaning they're definitely the piece I'm least confident about creating. To pick these off, I first create an undercut, then, using this as a guide, I slide a metal wire underneath the spout while spinning the wheel, and then I can pick them off. And I can be quite rough doing this, as I'm not going to be using the ends of the spouts anyway, so any indentations or fingerprints don't really matter. In terms of having a spout that pours well, much of that has to do with the internals of the teapot, such as the holes that connect the spout to the body. When throwing this section though, the edge of the spout does matter. The lip, I throw it to a sharp edge, rather than one that's overly rounded or squared off, as it appears here for a moment, just after the undulating section was sliced away. You also don't want your spout to be too wide at the opening, and you want the length of the spout to get narrow enough so that all the liquid is channeled through a smaller gap, which builds pressure, helping the liquid to jettison out with enough ferocity. Compare this to a shape that doesn't constrict so much, one with a wide opening that never channels the liquid. Instead of pouring out of a spout like that, the tea will cascade and dribble. And more often than not, it's spouts like this you often see on beginners' work, paired with improper positioning on the teapot's body, such as being too low on the shape, or the spout itself projects at the wrong angle, one that doesn't help the tea to channel as it's poured, resulting in spouts that dribble and sputter. And trust me, I made enough teapots like that to know what works and what doesn't. Although I still am occasionally caught out, as even if a teapot is constructed wonderfully, I might glaze it either badly or too thickly, and as the glass accumulates in the spout and on the pouring lip, this can change how the liquid flows or passes through these sections, resulting in a teapot that doesn't pour as well as it should have. I left the thrown components on their bats overnight, beneath a canopy of plastic and polystyrene, so no drafts hit the pots as they dry out slowly. If one side of a pot dries out faster than the other, it can cause the pot to lean in that direction, and in some cases this is irreparable, imparting an irregularity onto the pot you can't really correct, you just have to work with it. Now that the pots are leather hard, sliding a wire underneath them doesn't distort their shape whatsoever, although it is slightly harder to wire them off at this stage. But here's how I do it. I brace the bat against my knee and drag a very fine metal wire, which I hold to be very taut, underneath the pot. If I did this without bracing the bat against my knee, the pot and its wooden platform would just be dragged across the table, so some kind of brace is necessary to do this. I also make sure to wipe all the clay off the wire in between slices, as otherwise the excess material can build up and it makes the initial cut wider and potentially more uneven. That's only really a concern if you've thrown very thin pieces, but with the teapot bodies and their lids, there should be enough material in them to account for this, and I'll simply be able to turn any unevenness away. All the spouts are then moved onto one board, with the driest in the middle and those that are still a bit damp placed around the outside. I then immediately scrape the remaining clay off the bats, while it's still soft and comes off in one piece. This way less dust is produced, which in the long term I could breathe in, contributing to silicosis, or potter's rot as it's sometimes called. I then use these sticky scraps to pick up any specks of clay left on the table, and then they can be thrown into my reclaim bucket straight away. This is now the following day, and the teapots are finally dry enough to begin trimming. Trimming is one of those processes that if you try doing it when the clay isn't in perfect condition, you actually only end up making the process more difficult than it has to be. So throughout this entire process of trimming, constructing and attaching the handle for the teapot, I'm hyper aware about the condition and the dryness level of the clay. For instance, if the lid is considerably more dry than the body, when you turn them to make them fit, as the two parts dry thereafter, the lid can actually end up not fitting anymore. So I really try to make sure the lid and the body are the exact same consistency when trimming them to fit. So, let's go through the assembly process in a bit more detail. These two parts are the perfect condition of leather hard, and later I'll choose the spout for it. But for now I'm going to keep them wrapped up in plastic, as I want the lower half of them especially to remain soft, so they're easy to alter and attach to the teapot's body. When I throw the lids for any of my pots, I always make the locating flange slightly wider than it need be. This way I can always trim it back to fit, and I'm never caught out by a lid being too small for the vessel itself. At the leather hard stage, it's always easier to remove material than it is to add it back. So by leaving the vertical locating flange to be quite thick, I give myself a safety net of sorts, as there's always material left to work with. I begin by removing a few millimeters from this part, and then I offer the teapot up to it to see if it fits. If it doesn't, I simply remove the body and trim a tiny bit more away. Then I check it again, and I'll keep doing this until the teapot slots over it perfectly. Now that it fits, I'm going to tidy up the inside of the lid, as I can make the vertical locating flange thinner from the inside and remove a bit of the excess weight from the lid. The lids of my pots are quite thick and heavy objects, so by trimming away at the inside here, it helps to lighten them up, but I don't want to make the base too thin, as I will be turning the top side of this lid in a moment. The lid isn't finished yet, but for now it can be taken off and the teapot's body attached onto the wheel, which I do by placing it onto a pad of slip, rubbing it back and forth in place for a moment, and then tap centering it. I then use a plastic kidney to seal the bottom, which really helps secure the pot in place. From this point on, I begin trimming the walls of the pot with sharp tungsten carbide turning tools. In short, I'm thinning the walls slightly and refining the shape of the teapot, be it making sure the walls are perfectly straight and ensuring that any of the lines, ledges, and changes in angle are as crisp as possible. I then trim the lower, tapering section to come to a more narrow foot. Trimming is a much more mechanical process as compared to throwing. I grip these tools really firmly, with my fingers locked close to the blade so that it cuts along a straight line as I move it up and down. It's very easy to let the spinning clay influence the movement of the blade. For instance, if there's a slight undulation in the wall, it can be quite common for a beginner to simply follow that undulation, exaggerating it and making it worse the more you turn. Whereas in fact, you should be gripping the blade so strongly that you simply turn through and remove any unevenness or undulation. There are two downsides to the tungsten carbide trimming tools I use. The first being that they leave rather chattered, textured surfaces, so after I've finished using them, I often switch to a metal scraper, like this, to flatten over the walls. The other downside is that tungsten carbide is very brittle and fragile, which means if these tools are dropped, there's a really high chance that the blades will shatter or chip. The lid can then be trimmed in situ using the body of the teapot, like a chuck, to hold it in place. But I'm also using a spinner on top, which is centered, and through this I can apply downward pressure, pinning the lid in place, as when exerting force on the outside like so, the pressure can, in some cases, cause the lid to want to leap up out of its restraints. As for the lid, I'll be removing a lot of clay from the sides and from the top, so that it doesn't feel so heavy, dominating the rest of the shape. Ultimately though, the types of lids I'm making are heavier than more conventional ones, but it's also this weight which helps them stay in place when the teapots are used, as they're tipped to one side, the tea poured out. With the sides turned, I can move on to trimming the top, which I want to give a concave surface to create a hollow into which the glazes will pool nicely. And as my aim is to create a curved surface, I'm going to use a curved blade to carve the initial shape. I then smooth over this part with a curved metal kidney to scrape over the worst of the turning marks. I'll also burnish this surface smooth, which I do by using the very smooth side of the metal kidney, not its edge. I then pierce a hole in the middle of the lid, which annoyingly is just off centre, but as soon as the wheel stops spinning, you can't really notice. This hole is made to pull air through the teapot as it pours. This helps the liquid to flow out in a much neater stream, and you can clearly see the difference when I cover the hole, preventing air from being pulled in. This is especially important as the lid fits so well, as if you have a practically airtight lid with no hole in it, the teapot will sputter and pour terribly, so piercing a hole is crucial. I clean the hole up using the side of this piercer, and then I quickly flip it over, tap center it, and then I clean up the exit wound, the raised burrs of clay around the hole, and once again use the side of the metal piercer just to burnish it and to make sure there's no material left in the hole itself. Due to the lid being relatively heavy and all the downward pressure needed to trim it, I don't trim the gallery of the teapot until afterwards, as if this section is turned to be very thin and the angles very severe before the work on the lid has been done, turning the lid in situ like I just did could cause this section to collapse. It's happened to me before, numerous times, so now whenever I'm trimming lids, I always do the lid first and then the gallery underneath it. So much of learning to throw and trim pots is about learning a certain sequence of movements, and this routine can be very particular to the type of pots you make. With enough practice and enough repetition, say if you're making 100 mugs or 1,000 bowls, you gradually figure out a procedure that's quick and efficient, and technically the pots definitely improve the more you make of them. And I think it's one of the most important things about throwing and producing ceramics repetitively is that it really hones your skills and makes you a far more efficient maker. And look, Efficiency isn't everything, but the reason I got into this craft when I was 16 or 17 years old is because I actually wanted to be good at something. I wanted to be a quick, proficient maker, and I've always striven for a high level of craftsmanship and the ability to create a whole range of pots really well, and efficiency, for me, is one of those qualities. To trim the underside of the teapot, the piece can be flipped upside down, and now I'm using the lid of the pot as a chuck for the body, although of course, again, I am using the spinner on top. The foot is then beveled on the outside, creating an edge that's less likely to chip with use, whilst visually, this undercut, when placed on the table, creates a band of shadow that gives the impression the pot is floating ever so slightly above whatever surface it's placed on, thus giving you the perception that the teapot is light before you've even picked it up. I then place the teapot on a very smooth bat. This way the base, which is still leather hard and malleable, isn't indented by the grain of wood on my wearboards or on my other bats. The last thing to do for the lid is to tidy up any marks that are left on it, which are inevitably left as the body is trimmed on top of it. The rim of the pot often spins around and scratches the surface here, so it just needs a bit of a touch up before it can be called finished. I soften the really sharp angles with my fingertips, and then I trim the two flat sections of the locating flange so that they're totally smooth and free of any imperfections. As this part of the lid won't be glazed, the claywork will remain visible once fired, hence why I spend so much time making it as pristine as I can. And as this top edge is really the most important part of the pot, it's given one last check to make sure it's crisp all the way around. As if there's an indentation or some kind of inaccuracy in it, you'll be able to spot it from a mile off. Next, it's time to attach the spout. The teapot itself is always kept on this bat, this way I don't risk damaging the bottom of it unnecessarily. I then slice away much of the excess from the base of the spout and offer it up to the teapot to see how it fits. As this is a shape I haven't made many of before, I don't cut away too much initially, rather I slice away the clay bit by bit, checking how it looks on the teapot after each slither has been taken off. This feels about right, but I definitely need to make the join much neater. Thankfully though, as the clay is still quite soft, it's very easy to press and mould into a better shape, and once it's roughly stuck in the right place, I score all the way around the spout with a needle. This way I know where the holes need to be pierced. The spout is then taken off, and I use a wet sponge on a stick which I insert and twist around, leaving a lovely flush, smooth surface on the interior. Although I do quickly burnish over these surfaces with my fingertip, just to make sure there are no very coarse specks of sand that remain inside the spout. Next, I place the spout in a very shallow pool of water, and it's left here so that the clay can soften while I pierce the holes in the teapot's body. As I pierce these holes, I brace the walls from the inside. You can see how thinly they've been trimmed here, and without this support, the wall could very easily bow inward or crack. I then scrape away any burrs of clay left, before blowing very strongly to clear any debris. I then insert the round wooden handle of this potter's needle to clean the holes up and to burnish the insides of the holes smooth. Essentially, I'm removing anything that the glaze could potentially catch and build up on, thus blocking one of the holes. I then score the clay all the way around them, roughening up the surface, and then I dab slip over the scratches. This softens the clay in this area, and you can think of the slip like glue. I then take the spout, blow much of the excess water off it, and then press it firmly onto this scored area. The bottom portion of the spout, after sitting in the water, is now soft and workable, and I can easily blend it into the body of the teapot. This process takes some time, but essentially I go all the way around it, blending the spout in to the point that it looks like it's grown from the pot naturally. Once it's fully attached, I then use a wet sponge on a stick to really perfect the curve. The difference this makes is incredible, although it does leave a rough surface, as the soft clay is easily wiped away by the sponge, leaving lots of coarse specks of sand, creating a rather textured surface like this. And so to tidy that up, I use a wet finger to burnish and smooth all the way around the spout, compressing any coarse particles back into the stoneware body. With the spout attached and only the handle left to pull, I'd like to say that the teapot's almost finished, but there's still quite a lot of work to do, and that's not even including the bisque firing, the waxing, the glazing, the tidying up of the glaze and the wadding, and the reduction glaze firing. First though, the handle. I begin by scoring a patch opposite the spout so the two line up, of course. Slip is dabbed over this, and then I take a pulled blank of clay, holding it very gently in my hand as not to deform the length. I then tap at one end of it to flatten it and to create a flare of clay. This moves material into a better place for blending it into the body. If I didn't make this flare when trying to blend the handle into the body like I did the spout, I'd either have to add more material all the way around the join to blend in, or you might end up taking material from the length itself, thus creating a thin spot near the top of the join, which will ultimately make pulling the handle more difficult, as there's a thin, weak section, which will make it more likely for you to tear the handle off as you're pulling it. Once the flare of clay has been blended in all the way around, securing the handle in place, I can begin pulling it properly, which I do by soaking my right hand in water and then gripping and pulling down that length of clay, stretching it longer and thinner, keeping the pressure constant from the moment I squeeze near the top of the join until my grip has passed the end of the length of clay. I pull with the same grip but from both the left and the right, this way the cross section of the handle remains even, and once the handle is long enough, I push on the underside of the join so that it springs away from the teapot in a similar angle as the spout does. This way, despite the spout and the handle being different visually, there is a sort of symmetry to them. It's for this same reason that I don't make one larger than the other. I want both components to roughly fill the same amount of physical space on either side, so the two parts balance out. Once the handle has been looped down and the bottom join blended in, I push up on the underside of the handle and roll it into the join to create a better shape. I'd like these handles to really spring upwards, and it turns out there is quite a bit of shaping you can do after they've been pulled, but it's best not to overdo it, as this length of clay can become oversaturated with water very quickly, and once that happens, it'll have a very difficult time holding its shape. Next, I'll put the lid back on and I'll dry these teapots upside down. This way the soft clay doesn't lose its shape, as when left for a few hours the clay could sag, the handle losing the lovely arch it has. And I'll leave them like this to dry and stiffen up overnight. Typically, I work on one teapot at a time. This means I'll trim the components to fit, attach the spout, and pull the handle, and then move on to the next teapot, as opposed to turning them all, attaching all the spouts, and then pulling all the handles. And whilst that may be a more efficient method, as all these teapots are individuals, I'd rather focus on one at a time. If instead I made 20 teapots that were all identical, then I would turn them all, and then do all the spouts and then all the handles, as I'd have a better chance at making them all the same doing it this way. Now, I'd like to take this moment to talk about spouts and positioning, and I'll sacrifice this spout to demonstrate how they should not be attached. I should say though, this advice is for those learning to make teapots, as of course there are exceptions to the rules. But generally speaking, you don't want to attach them projecting horizontally like so, especially so far down the body of the teapot, as if joined this far down, you can only fill the teapot up so much before it begins to come out of the spout. A good rule to follow is that the tip of the spout should be more or less level with the opening of the teapot. This way the entire vessel can be filled up without tea flowing out of it prematurely. And I know that might sound blindingly obvious, but it's something I see all the time. The spout should also be attached at roughly a 45-degree angle. If it's less than this, then the tea won't jettison out in quite the same way. And beyond that, visually, if the spout is attached improperly, it can really mess with the aesthetic of the pot, as we all know roughly what a teapot should look like, so when something's off, it becomes very noticeable. If there's too much weight left in the spout, I use a knife to slice away much of it, as I need a large enough opening on this end so all 7 of the pierced holes flow into it. I then go back in with the sponge on a stick and really fettle away the inside to smooth over any marks left from the carving. Then I spin the spout in place, compressing the walls with my finger. I then very lightly stick it onto the teapot, more or less exactly where I want it. I then score around the outside of the spout, marking it so I know where to put the holes. The spout is then placed into the shallow pool of water to soften up. I was once taught to pierce the holes at a 45-degree angle, rather than just being drilled straight in, as this way they match the angle of the spout and aid the flow of the liquid, but I'm not honestly sure how much of a difference this makes. This is the piece of wood I use to smooth the holes and to make them neater. It's pushed in, twisted around and rotated, smoothing and burnishing the insides of the holes and cleaning up their appearance on this side especially. I do in fact clean the other side too, but I don't do so until the pots have turned bone dry. Then I use a sponge on a stick, almost like a piece of sandpaper, to smooth the holes on the inside, free of any burrs of clay. The surface is then scratched up, and yes, I should probably use a serrated kidney, but the needle does a good job, and I'm a bit more accurate with it. Slip is then brushed over in such a way that I don't smooth the lines I've just scratched, rather I'm filling the grooves with this liquid clay. As the spout is pushed on, I watch from the inside to make sure it's lined up perfectly with the holes, whilst double checking that it's projecting straight from the pot. The excess clay is then blended into the body like shown previously. I use my fingers for the majority of the work, and sometimes a wooden dowel if my fingers don't quite fit, which is normally the case around the top of the spout. Blending the spout in flush is really an aesthetic choice from my end. As long as the joint is sealed, you can almost do whatever you like. But I would recommend getting some sponges on sticks for this process, or diddlers as they used to be called in potteries in the past in this country. And the last step for each spout is just to soften over those coarse grains of grog that appear on the surface as the softer clay around them is ground away. And lastly, it's time to pull the handle. To make the individual handle blanks for these, I start off with a larger block of clay which I pull with a wet hand into a long strap. My aim at this point isn't to create the final handle, rather I'm pulling thicker lengths of clay which can then be attached to the pot and pulled further into their final, more finessed shape. I begin by looking at the teapot from the side and score a line to determine the height of where I want the handle to spring from. Then I score another mark that's in line with the spout, and then I score this area with a serrated kidney to roughen up the surface in preparation for pulling the handle. I flare the blank out on one end, and then press it against that scored and slipped area, which I brace from the inside with my fingertips, so the pressure from the clay being pushed against the teapot body doesn't deform the wall by bowing it inwards, which it would likely only do if you've trimmed the walls to be too thin, or you've scored the area and slipped it, and then let it sit for far too long, the slip weakening the wall. So, in between scoring and slipping and attaching the handle blank, I never wait too long. And it's also worth mentioning that I use the handle blanks immediately after they've been pulled. I don't wait and let them stiffen up, as the clay is easiest to blend into the body when it's still soft, and it's also easier to pull although you do need to make sure that you aren't spending too much time pulling your handles. It's a process that should take 2 to 3 minutes, max. But if it takes you much longer and you're really oversaturating the clay with water, then the handle will weaken, the material will degrade, and you'll have a much more difficult time getting the handle to keep its shape. I then lift the teapot up and let the handle arch down. For this specific style of handle, I actually pull them to be larger than I'd normally like, and after the bottom join has been smoothed in, flush, I spend some time pushing the excess length in the handle into more of an ear shape, with more of a curve at the top before arcing back down and joining on the lower half of the body. Again, some adjustments can be made, but it'll be much easier to change the shape of this handle once it's firmed up a bit. And there's still quite a lot of work left in my handles, as I still need to carve each one individually, which from this angle you may not think I need to do, and I actually probably don't have to do it, but I feel it makes such a difference, as it refines the shape and perfects the curve, especially on some of the teapots which have more complicated shapes. Sometimes it can be finicky to get all the clay into the right positions, or to get the top join as thin as I'd like it. So instead, I do it the following day after the handles have dried out slowly overnight. This one might be my favourite from the batch. There's something about the spout and handle that are really balanced, and this is the first teapot I've ever made with a stepped lid, and I can't wait to see how it looks once glazed and fired. Here's the first 10, all similar but very different, with handles, lids and spouts that unify them. Like I mentioned, if the handles are still slightly soft, I let them dry overnight upside down. This way the handles keep their shape, otherwise they can potentially slump. I then give them a thorough spray with water and then wrap them up tightly so they dry in their own humid environment overnight. And by doing so, the body and the handle acclimatise to each other and become the same consistency. This way the parts will dry out at an even rate hereafter, and it should prevent any cracks or splits from developing around the joins. The following morning they can be unwrapped, and now I'll be doing 2 things. The first is to carve their handles, to make them finer and to fix the curve on the underside of the handle, where the middles of your fingers rest as the teapot is used. I really take my time with this, as it's surprisingly easy, as you might imagine, to make a mistake during this stage. One wrong move and too much can be sliced away, a hole can be pierced in the wall, and the handle can even be ripped off. So just like when throwing the walls, I do it bit by bit, making it thinner and thinner as I go. I even do a bit of work on the spout, all before fettling over these areas with a sponge on a stick to soften the more obvious marks left by the knife, and like I've done numerous times throughout this video, I can press these surfaces with my fingertips to remove any of the really sharp specks of grog. The absolute final step is just to burnish the base of the pot, as there's always a chance that the base may pick up a burr of clay or be scratched as the spout and handle are attached. The lid is also given one final check, both below and above, which normally only takes a few seconds. And that's this teapot finished for now. The curve of the handle is now just much more natural, and I've thinned the top out slightly so there's less material in it. Here's a better example of how a handle might look before it's been carved, with this strange bump and ever so slightly uneven sides, and I should be able to carve the lump away so it curves perfectly into the body. I hope this makes it apparent just how much work goes into each teapot. It's the reason they cost what they do, ranging generally from £250 to £400. I still also get better with each batch, and it's interesting, the more time I spend making other pots, whenever I come back to teapots, I always find the process slightly easier, their proportions better, the pots lighter, more delicate, and finished with a higher degree of craftsmanship. And here's how that same handle looks once carved. The unwanted bump is no longer there, and it follows a more flowing curve, with sharper edges, which I don't mind as my glazes always react interestingly over them. Despite these teapots being finished, I'll still keep them under wraps to dry slowly. It can take about 3 to 4 weeks for them to turn completely bone dry, but I'm not in a rush at the moment, so I'm happy to leave them wrapped up in a corner of the studio if it means that absolutely no cracks will form around the handle or the spout. If I were to try and dry these quickly, I would completely unwrap them and move them apart so air can get all the way around them, so every side of the teapot dries out at the same rate. Carving away at the handles like this does get rid of some of the character left from the pulling process, so I make sure I don't carve away too much from any indentations or grooves left by my thumb and fingers, such as that one you can see on the back of the handle here. The foot is then cleaned over, and I double check to make sure there are no specks of clay lodged in my maker's mark. And that's all of the teapots finally finished. And I'll now wrap them up loosely so they can continue drying slowly. In a moment, I'm going to show you all 20 teapots with a number next to each to identify it, and I'd love it if you left a comment telling me which number is your favourite. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this long video. I hope it helps you to make better teapots and to think about their design and the creation process. I adore making them, but they can be overwhelming objects to create, especially if you've never attempted one. But like anything, the first few are always going to be terrible, and you've got to make a few bad teapots before you make any good ones. And before I forget, Merry Christmas from me and Chiro, and as always, I'll see you next time.